Hello there, sword friends. This is going to be a review on a JKOO Sword Sanmai Katana. Now, there are biases that you need to know, as I often tell you before you hear me say other things. Know that, one, this sword was sent to me with the specific idea of review and destruction. It was sent to me from JKOO Sword, and they solicited my opinion by sending me this sword. So I am going to break it. I'm going to go through the review process as I normally do and then break it, but that's what it was sent to me to do. I know that makes some of you cringe, but that's its destiny. Also, no, I'm not being paid to do the review, but I don't have to return the sword after it's broken. So if that bears any relevance to you in terms of what compensation looks like to me, I'm not being paid to do the review. I'm not an employee of Sino Sword or JKOO Sword, but I'm not sending the remnants of whatever's left of this back. So there's that. The last bit is I'm not an expert. These are my thoughts, my general opinions, and take them with a grain of salt. I'm a hobbyist. I'm no teacher. I'm no master of any kind. And I'm not articulating or arguing that the way I do things or the way I think is the only way or the right way. So just know that as you hear me go on. So JKOO's website offers a way to customize the sword, and that's what this sword was initially intended or started off being, in that I could go and I filled out something, and basically I asked for the moon. I asked for a tamahagane with a kobusei type construction and all sorts of other weird nonsense. And I'm really at the mercy of what they want to send for a review sample, but I am happy that I got the kosher I asked for, and I think it's pretty cool that they offer that service. And now, again, I'm not going to hold against them that they didn't send me exactly what I asked for, because what I asked for was stupid expensive and overly difficult, specifically for those two reasons. I wanted to see kind of the maximum of what they could do with some very goofy nonsense. And anyway, they sent me a review sample that at least had some of the characteristics that I'm asking for and will give me something interesting to test. Now, that said, I think the option to customize your sword is actually really cool, especially at this price point. When I do custom projects, it can be very expensive. And granted, if you're completely starting from scratch, working with very high-end custom makers, you can really fine-tune the sword to exactly what you want. But in this case, to be able to even pick colors and feature sets and some of that stuff is pretty interesting and compelling, especially with the flexibility they seem to have. I asked for a kind of a weird Bohi situation, and they pulled it off. Now, it's not perfect, but it's also not a very expensive sword. The point is, though, that I provided pictures, and I was very specific about what I wanted, and if that's something that you're looking for something kind of off the beaten path, I'd advise that you provide ample documentation and ideally photos, because sometimes things can get lost in translation. So if you can do something like that, that would be good. Anyway, I think that's a cool part of the website. It seems economically priced, but now I'm going to talk about this here sword. So now, as I look at the sword, we will go as we normally do through the features. So I have an ironed Fuchikashira, at least that is what it's supposed to be. What I do notice is I like that it's just simple blackened looking stuff rather than anything fancy-pantsy or overly embellished. Now, the casting on it is very rudimentary, and some of the details that should be crisp are muddled a little bit. But again, I'm keeping in contrast the price point. That said, Hanwei offers swords for the $300 range, and they have more detailed fittings. Even in their simplicity, they can be more detailed. Now, as I look at the transitions, there is a little bit of a ledge that happens on the kashira, and that is distracting, but I didn't find it cumbersome. It didn't bite into me while I was moving it around, but as I run my finger over it, I think it has the potential to be problematic. The Fuchi has the same kind of little ledges. They don't line up perfectly, and that's not necessarily expected, but it certainly would be nice if the transitions and the lines kind of mesh perfectly. In any case, they're on there tight, and that's good. The next bit I can talk about is the Ito, and the Ito is tight. Now, it's not the tightest Ito, but in terms of mass production sword, this is very tight. It doesn't move around under pressure. I have to apply a lot of pressure just to get it to budge even in the slightest bit, which is great. The diamonds actually look reasonably even. They're a little off kilter in some spots, not perfect. They're also a little bit small, but I'd say that they're a lot more even than they tend to be on swords of this price point or in mass production swords in general. Now, I asked for a full wrap of Samegawa. I don't see that it's a very high-end skin, but I believe I do have a full wrap of Samegawa. As I look at the ska with the Fuchi off, I can see that there's a full wrap there. And everything is tight, the end knot is good, and everything seems quite nice. I did notice when I initially started using the sword that there was a little bit of a have like a pokey thing on the end of this knot, where maybe it got snipped, and if the silk is plastic or has some, I don't know, there's something that pokes into my finger just a little bit on the end here, but it has worn off as I've used it a little bit. So nothing really drastic at all in terms. It's actually a very comfortable handle. It doesn't have like an hourglass shape. It's kind of a plain Jane looking thing, but it's not too big, it's not too small. It fits very comfortably in my large hand size, even though it's not what I would consider a very large handle. The Menuki are really difficult for me to make out. I think they're dragon Menuki. I'm not honestly sure. Again, very similar to the Fujikashira, where the details appear very kind of muddied. I'm not necessarily expecting a lot for what I paid, and honestly, kind of the muddied, simple look I prefer to the blingy, zazzy thing. This aesthetically, I actually think is okay, but I will admit that I'd like to see, even in these simple fittings, crisper casting detail, and I don't make that out on this particular set of Fujikashira Menuki. In other notes, the handle doesn't rattle, it comes off as it's supposed to, and it wasn't cracked out of the box, which is something I have to give at least some note to. It's very common with mass production swords to have the handles hammered on. In this case, it wasn't cracked at all. It doesn't wiggle, and it fits really well. It disassembles acceptably. In terms of its construction for its price, I'm very pleased. Moving on to the Tsuba. The Tsuba is a swirly Mitsudome, and I am inherently enamored and biased when it comes to swirly Mitsudome shapes, so I love it. The thing I'll note is that there's a little bit of contrast. It has a very blendy, goody look. Those aren't words that necessarily make sense, but it has a rim on it, so it's not just a simple cutout. It has a little bit more zazz to it, if you will. I think it goes really well, but again, some of the details are muddied. It's not perfect, but it's not supposed to be. It's simple. I can tell it's a cast Tsuba, and I would like to again see crisper details, but I'm glad that it's not just a simple cut out with a jet type thing, a water jet or something like that. It does have some character to it. It's also a swirly Mitsudome, and therefore it's super cool, and I like it. Now, there are some things to note with this kind of Tsukashi looking Tsuba, and that is that the seppa underneath don't necessarily line up super well. Ideally, these would be filed down, and you wouldn't see such a big, bulging transfer of seppa here, but it's not necessarily uncommon or something uncharacteristic either. Still, I would like to not see this ledge on the seppa and to have them line up a little bit better. That's again detail work, and I could probably take a file and make that happen, but I don't really want to. In any case, the Tsuba is tight. It still came off reasonably well, so functionality-wise, in terms of how it fits, everything is the way it's supposed to be. Well, everything functions for its intended purpose. It's not loose or rattly. It's not the way it's supposed to be. There's a lot of fine details in terms of the way it's supposed to be, and approaching them is noble. Getting them is unexpected, and I am rambling, so I'm going to stop. Let's talk about the habaki now. The habaki has a little bit of character to it. It's not the same plain Jane brass habaki as everything else. It really is. It's just been dolled up in a way that is nice. But it adds a little bit of character, and I like it. Now, I asked for a silver one, and I got a brass one. I'm not really going to blame it. Again, I'm at the mercy of what they'll send. I do like this shape, though. It's a classy-looking shape, and I'm glad that they offer something that's just not the same plain brass habaki. In terms of how it fits on the blade, it holds in spots, for mass production habaki, I think it's actually reasonably well done. The other note is that the habaki, munmachi, hamachi, where they line up, are parallel. That's something I asked them to be. Often I see on mass production swords that the hamachi, munmachi are off kilter, or one is higher than the other. They're not on the same parallel line for whatever reason. I asked specifically for them to be parallel. They are, and I'm glad they went the extra mile and got that detail. I don't know if it's something that they typically offer on their swords, but in this case, it was requested and delivered. The downside is that the sai has never really held the habaki super tight. Now, I'm going through a seasonal change where it's going from really humid to really dry, and I got it in the humid portion, and it was a little tighter, and now it's drying out a little bit, and it's a bit looser. I think it's right on the cusp of, really kind of acceptable. A small shim would probably resolve the issue really quickly, and it seems like it was probably fitting pretty well when it was shipped to me, but that's something that you might expect. It wasn't super tight, and it was likely manufactured that way, but it's fixable is what I'm saying, and it's within the realm of tolerance that, I bet it was probably the way it was supposed to be when it was shipped out to me. Anyway, it's a small issue. It's not super loose or anything in there, and it's The problem is that it, kind of freely falls out, which isn't great. It also has some issues kind of lining up a little bit, where it seems like the habaki is banging on things. Now, I don't have a problem as I'm doing noto or doing any kind of drawing practice. I don't notice this so much, but at the same time, it's got some imperfections in some spots where the saya was clearly, probably not made for this one specific blade. Anyway, it's remediable and it's acceptable. The saya. Now, the saya is a fully rattan wrap saya with ishime lacquer on it, and I have to admit I'm a really big fan of this look. In practice, it's really actually not bad. I wasn't expecting to like it as much as I do, honestly. One, I think if you get the gloss black version of this, a lot of the imperfections in rattan stand out more, but aesthetically, with the ishime kind of being an imperfect, kind of stonish surface, I think it really blends well and lends itself well to the imperfections in the rattan. And to me, it makes it feel a little bit more, the imperfections add character here rather than irritation or an eyesore. So also from a pragmatic standpoint, it doesn't feel weird to have this in my obi or anything like that. It doesn't drag as I have to do sayabiki. From a practical standpoint, I guess what I'm getting at is that the ridges and things like that don't provide any resistance or problems for functionality. I'd also note that it doesn't show fingerprints very easily, though if it chipped, I'd imagine it'd probably be a little more difficult to solve that problem. I haven't had a problem with it chipping, and I've banged it into a few things, so the paint seems reasonably durable. I also like that the rattan wrapping offers an extra little bit of resistance for the sword not cutting through the scabbard. It's going to be harder for it to cut through that rattan, at least theoretically, and it offers an additional layer of protection for your hand in case you have a bad draw, you cut through your saya into the meat of your hand, unfortunately. That is something that happens, and hopefully it's less likely to happen with this fully rattan wrap saya. Now, in terms of the koiguchi, that's made of horn, the kurigata is made of horn, the korijiri is made of horn. They seem to be reasonably well done. The kurigata is fit on in such a way where there's, some mild imperfections in terms of where it sits in the rattan and how the rattan was done around it, but overall, I think the execution is actually pretty good for the price point. I mean, having a fully rattan wrap saya would cost, typically in a custom project, more than the whole of this blade does. The blade costs, I think, around $320-ish or $327. I have to double check on the pricing, but a lot of times to get a fully rattan wrap saya, it costs a lot more money than just that for the saya itself. So, additionally, I'll note that the saya came wrapped with a sageo and had these little shitatome pieces. I don't know if I'm saying that right, so forgive me if I'm not, but they pop out really easy. That's a common thing that I notice, is that they don't really hold in there very well, which makes me almost not want to have them at all. The sageo is nice and long. I like that. Depending on the style you do, sometimes a long sageo doesn't work for you because you just drape the sageo behind the sword. That's the way it works in Katori anyway. But in Toyama, if I have too short a sageo, then I can't tie it off properly. So it depends on what you do, but you could always, shorten the sageo theoretically, but you can't really make it longer without replacing it anyway. So the other thing I can note about the saya is that it does not have much rattle in it. I can shake the saya around and the sword doesn't really rattle a lot inside it. And as such, it didn't come with a lot of blemishes or issues with the blade itself. The blade was reasonably clean. Speaking of the blade, let's look at it. So this blade is supposed to be a Sanmai constructed blade. Later on in the review, I'm going to do some destructive testing. This portion of the review doesn't have the destructive testing because it's not broken yet. So it's supposed to be Sanmai. We'll find the truth of that later. The reason I say the truth of that is that there is some question from some manufacturers about, if you pay for a Sanmai blade, do you actually get a Sanmai blade? Or do you pay for a Sanmai blade and you get something that has been aesthetically altered to look like it's laminated, but it isn't? And the only way to really tell is to crack it in half, put an etchant in it, and see if the core is different than the panels or the sides. But you should be able to see the different steels, if you break it open, but not otherwise. So it's notoriously difficult to find the truth of that kind of thing without breaking your sword, and in that case, that's a bummer. So we'll get to that point later, is what I'm saying. But if I look at just the blade, there's some very aesthetically appealing things that I can see from the folding. I'm really a fan of how the blade came and looked. I asked for Kobuse, they provided Sanmai. I'm glad they gave me a laminated blade just to test if they are capable of doing lamination pieces. But as I look at the blade itself, there's a couple things that just stand out and come to mind right away. I do see what looks like a lamination line. The folding pattern is subtle, but still present. And if you're looking for something aesthetically, I think that this offers some, nice artistic looking steel, and there's some character to it. Now, it's not the way a traditional sword would be. I'm not arguing that it's historic in that sense, but there is something very pretty about a folded blade and the steel having some characteristics of folding and lamination. I think it's a pretty thing. At $300 something ish, $320, it's a lot of the competition out there isn't folded. There are some other options out there, but like a practical series from Hanwei or some of the pieces from Dynasty Forge, they're not folded in that price point. They're not laminated, they're not folded. And so to get those two things is a really kind of feature-rich option, especially at that price point. And folding doesn't make it perform any better. It doesn't make it sharper, or it doesn't really do much other than be pretty. But the fact that it is pretty is nice. And there's, if you'd like to take the sword out and admire some of the characteristics in the steel from an artistic perspective, or aesthetically you just like it, then neat. I'm just saying that the steel looks pretty. That's a really long-winded way to say it, but that's basically what I'm saying. So I do see that. Now, the Yokote is not super well polished. The general polish on it seems to be a mix between mirror polish. It's not what I would quite call an art polish. The Yokote is geometric. I can feel like a transition, though that doesn't really matter to me. Historically, it could be, there could be a tangible transition here, or there might not be. In any case, this has aesthetically a pretty look, but the Yokote is not super well done. In addition, it's not really burnished. It has the same kind of mirror polish on it. I'm not going to complain about it, though. It does the job and it looks nice. And there is a kind of a nice transitional shape here. I think the aesthetics of the shaping of the blade are quite nice. I didn't ask for anything particular in terms of geometry. I asked for a little bit of Niku, and what I can see is that is delivered in terms of the general shaping. I didn't ask for anything in particular of Sori, but I did ask for a small distal taper, and that has been achieved. I will provide the sword dynamics and very specific measurements in just a moment. But furthering the blade, in terms of the polish, the lines on the blade, the flats are very, very clean, very flat. I'm actually pretty impressed. At $300, this is something a lot of people miss. Along the flats, there are usually a lot of ripples in the surface, hammer marks, grinding marks, and this is smooth as glass. So compliments to them on that. It doesn't necessarily make it a better cutter, but it is a difficult thing to do, and I appreciate they have achieved it. Now in the Bohi, I do see all the little ripple marks and things like that. Those are a lot harder and a lot more time consuming to clean up, and that is not a surprise. I've seen very few swords with very smooth Bohi lines in terms of them being flat in the groove of the Bohi, and a lot of times it's on very, very expensive swords. The Bohi is another thing to note. Now, I asked for a very weird Bohi. Now, I could have sworn I've seen this style on historic blades at least once or twice, but granted, it's a very obscure thing. There's a kind of a naginata-hi style Bohi at the base that starts about an inch up, and then it transitions to I can't remember the name, but I'll put it in the details below, but a double Bohi. And I asked for the transitions to be clean. Now, they pinged me and said, why do you want that? That seems kind of off. And I said, for one simple reason, it gives me a chance to look at two different style Bohis that you can provide on one blade. And in retrospect, I kind of wish I had done one kind of standard thick Bohi along one side and this on the other. But this does give me a chance to look at a couple things. One, the Bohi themselves, they did it. So that's kind of cool. They gave me two different styles of Bohi. They were flexible. That's probably a weird thing that they haven't done before, and they did it, which I think is actually is kind of neat. I don't know, it's not intended as a historic thing, though again, I could have sworn I've seen it. It was really intended to provide two different examples on a review sample, so you could see two different things that they're capable of doing. But as I look at it, one, the initial Bohi is is reasonably well done. I'm not super happy with how the ending termination feels. It's not as crisp as I think it could be. For $300, I'm thinking it's fine. And the fact that they did something weird and it's, you know, in the $320-ish range is actually pretty cool. But the transitions are not super clean. They do terminate at the same spot, however, which is nice. Now that's for the initial bohi. The later bohi actually begins. They're not even in terms of where they start exactly, which is kind of a weird thing. They start maybe just a couple millimeters off, so they're not using it on a template or something like that, because they begin in marginally different spots. It's not something that's super noticeable, but as I turn it back and forth, I can see pretty clearly that they terminate, or rather begin, in different spots. Towards the kasaki, I can also see that there are some very, very subtle minor differences between where they terminate. One terminates kind of right at the yokota here, the other is a couple millimeters below. So I'm not sure exactly if that's because this was just a weird thing. I also will note on this double bohi, I'm not super impressed with how crisp the termination, the ending and beginning lines are. It looks like it's a mill that just kind of starts and then is gradually lifted off, rather than having something very pristine and sharp that kind of ends off in here. Now this makes it easier actually to clean, but from an aesthetic standpoint, it doesn't have the same crisp nature that you would expect on a higher end polish. Anyway, I will admit that I like that they did two of them. That's kind of cool, and it opens up an option for you potentially if you want to do some weird combination of bohi yourself. But more or less, I'm kind of impressed with their flexibility to do both, but not impressed necessarily with the quality of the termination of the bohi. Anyway, the various options are nice, and I really can't complain too much. Again, to put it in perspective, this is a $320-ish sword. The fact that it has a full wrap of samegawa, it's the itos tied with hishigami, it's got iron fittings, a decorative habaki, weird construction of bohi, that it's folded and laminated in a sanmai construction, and that's done for $320-ish. It's a lot of features, and I can't necessarily expect every one of them to be crystal clear. So I'm just giving you an idea of where my head is at. Now, in terms of the sharpness, it's quite sharp. It's been used already, so I can't really show you the sharpness and fairness because it's been smacked around quite a bit. But as it is, I will move on to how it feels in terms of in the hand. So the first thing I'm going to note is that I did notice that there was a little something pokey on the ito. It didn't really bother me as I was moving it around. Dynamically, it's a very comfortable sword. Now, when I initially asked for the sword, I asked for it to be 31 inches, which is a little bit more in my size. This one came in at 28 inches. So it's a smaller sword, and it's going to feel kind of more nimble than swords that I would normally practice with. But that said, for its size, it seems to be a reasonable balance. I have absolutely no problem moving this around and doing kata with it. It's a reasonably comfortable experience to do. I have no problem kind of making it all the way through a class or two with it, and it's just fine. It works just fine in terms of a practice, for the practice of Iaido if you want to use the Shenken. In terms of cutting, well, that's just a bit different. Now, the testing that I've done to this point in the review is basically water bottles, tatami mats, and rolled newspapers. The things that really you should expect it to cut. And to that end, it's done quite well. It's reasonably sharp. There's no secondary bevel to note. I've had that problem on other JKOO swords. This one seems to have the right style geometry in that there's no secondary bevel. And I found it to be a pretty reasonable cutter. Now, in terms of water bottles, it's controllable. The Kasaki, it's easy to thrust, cut through tatami mats, but that's me. I've had other people cut with this sword. One is sword friend James. He came over and helped me do some cutting in the backyard. He got a chance to whack this into pool noodles and water bottles and tatami mats and stuff like that, and he did pretty well. But another gentleman at my Toyama Ryu dojo went and tried to use this, and comparatively speaking, he did not fare as well. He started using a sword more geared towards specific tatami mat cutting, and then later tried this one as on the third mat, and this one did not fare as well. So the basic gist that I would say in terms of dynamics, well, it's comfortable, I wouldn't mind using it. It seems to be a balance sword in that if you want to cut tatami, it can, but it's not going to function as well as pieces that are specifically designed and engineered to do that task. Likewise, if you want to do trick cutting, it's going to be a little heavier. It's not as nimble and light. It's not geared toward one specific task, but as an all-around sword. If you want to do a little tatami, you also want to use that same sword for doing iaido or doing kata or practicing. It's a reasonably well-balanced sword, but again, it just doesn't excel at any one particular category. So again, balance is not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of people don't have a sword for cutting tatami and another sword for iaido. A lot of people just have one sword. So having some degree of balance across all those categories is nice, while simultaneously having some aesthetic properties that are alluring. So as it sits, as I am in this part of the review, do I think that it's worth it? Well, that is, yeah. I mean, honestly, for $320 to get all of these features in one, and a sword that functions as well as this does for as many tasks as it does, I think absolutely. If you're somebody that's looking for just one sword and you want to have a lot of features on it, yeah, I really think that this is a very great value for the money. Now, that said, there are some gripes that I would have about it. One, aesthetically, what I would say is that it gives you a lot of features, but it doesn't necessarily do any of them well. And that seems to be a theme going across the sword as a whole. It does a lot of things, but it doesn't excel at any one in particular. The fittings are iron and a lot of the features come together, but there's some misses on some of the details in terms of construction, in terms of how well the fittings are cast, in terms of some of the detail there. The blade gives you two bohi of different sorts. You have a sanmai construction, and there's some coolness in the polish, but the termination on the bohi, the polish on the yakote, it's just not super crisp. And overall, that's really my main complaint, is that everything could be more crisp. For $320, I don't really think it could be more crisp. In fact, I think it could be a lot crappier and still be worth $320. But if JKOO wants some advice on how to push things to the next level, it's really taking what you're offering now and just crisping up the details. But overall, still, yeah, I think it's a great sword, value for the money. But I wouldn't necessarily advise it if you're strictly doing tatami mat cutting. It wouldn't be my first choice if you're strictly going to use it for iaido or kata. There are lighter blades that you could use to do that. It wouldn't strictly be what I would recommend if you are going for a folded aesthetic that has, just a lot of detail in the blade for you to admire. If you're looking for any one of those particular things, there's probably things that are better suited to deliver those individual things. But if you want something that's balanced across all, I'll admit that's a tough thing. That's a tough way to balance across all of those things when you talk about cutting a cutting blade for cutting tatami, water bottles, things like that. Something light enough to do EI with, and also aesthetically pleasing enough to warrant spending maybe a little bit more money because it's folded or sanmai. The blades that I think of like that are maybe the Skydro Warrior Sword or the Hanwei Bushido blade. I think this has very similar characteristics to those swords, but it offers a few things that they don't. Namely, the sword construction is kind of bohi. I'm not going to talk about that, but this is supposed to be a laminated blade. Now, the Hanwei and the Skydro are all in the $800 category for that type of sword. This is $300. So while those blades offer some finer details and some things that fit together a little bit better, this one gives you some additional features at a much lower price point. Admittedly, I'd probably rather have a Hanwei Bushido or a Skydro Warlord sword. They tend to have, in my experience, they're a little bit better, but also a lot more money. So for $320, I would not hesitate in recommending the sword. That is where I'm at so far in the review, and I'm sorry that was a very rambly thing, but I think it helps to know why I'm thinking what I'm thinking, as goofy and rambly and hard to articulate as that can be. Hopefully that helps explain why I'm thinking what I'm thinking. In any regard, at this point in the review, I have tested the sword like I would a normal sword. I've used it like I would a normal sword. And now it's time for me to do some stupid things with the sword and break it and move on to that portion of the review. So as it stands right now, I think it's a great value. But the things that might change that are, if it's advertised as Sanmai and it's not, I'm gonna have some, kind of harsh words to say. If it breaks really easily when I start doing some of the stupid stuff, I'm gonna not think very highly of the sword. As it stands, it's held up to every test I put it to, and it's done exceptionally well. Well, not exceptionally well in terms of cutting, but it's held up and it's stayed straight. And I've had some bad cuts, and I've whacked it into a stand, and it's done its job. But the destructive testing will let me know how far I can really push it before bad stuff starts to happen. If that happens really quickly on some of just the more minor hard stuff, that's not going to be good. But if it holds up all the way through and ends up being a Sanmai blade, well, then I'm gonna have to give it a few more accolades than I already have. So that's where I'm at right now. Let's continue with the review. Now, the breaking really started off with some beer cans. No real edge damage or anything to note other than it looks cool. That was really the point of cutting them. It's a lot of fun, and I had them. There was really nothing to note damage-wise, though. The polish took some scratches. That's really expected when you cut any kind of metal. But that's really about the only thing that happened in this particular test. The next bit is I moved on to a dead branch that was in my yard and that I had to break up anyway. Now, in using the dead branch as a medium to cut, it was a little cumbersome to move around and I had trouble getting it stable, but whatever. The thing I'd say is at the end I noticed that there was a little bit of an edge ding in the edge, and I don't know exactly what strike it came from. It wasn't there after the cans, but it happened after somewhere during the process of cutting the branch. Now, I don't know if there was a staple or if maybe there was some dirt or rock that was stuck in bark or something like that that maybe I nicked. Not 100% sure, but in any case, there was some minor edge damage from cutting the branch. The next thing I moved on to was just logs. The first one cut actually really easily, but the second one had a knot in it. And when I put a lot of gusto into the strike, the sword actually bent. Now, the sword is going to continue to bend as I strike stupider targets, but at the same point, I was a little surprised that the sword bent, but not terribly surprised. I am striking a log with a lot of force with a sword that's not an axe, so that shouldn't come as a surprise. Though many other swords haven't bent when I've struck logs. Those are usually through-hardened swords. This is a differentially hardened blade, so the fact that it bent, again, I think is completely within the realm of acceptable, though I'm a little surprised it bent when it did. Not anything bad, just noting that other swords have held up a little bit better here than this one has, but I'd still put this well within the realm of reason. I'd also note that even though the sword's bending now, it hasn't bent on a lot of strikes through bad cuts in tatami, bad cuts in rolled newspaper, whacking it into the stand. I've had a lot of times where this sword has absorbed impact and not bent, so I guess that's why I find it a little surprising that it bent here, but then again I shouldn't because this is destructive testing. After cutting just some logs, I move on to a tree trunk that is a pine tree that I took down about a week ago. So it's still pretty wet. Anyway, there's lots of hard strikes that go into the trunk here, and in a nutshell, the sword bends, and that's really what I noticed. There's no edge damage, and I do have to give some props there. The edge has held up really, really well, and I haven't noticed that any chunks or any other bits or dings are noticeable throughout the entire process of cutting into these trunks, and that would be acceptable. A lot of times a chunk will come out, especially if it's a folded blade or differentially hardened. The chunks of the edge are known to come out, and that did not happen here, and I found that pretty impressive. The sword did bend, and all it really took was whacking it on a nearby tree the opposite direction to get it straightened out, and then back up to going and doing dumb stuff I was. Now after whacking it into the tree trunk, I moved on to some sheet metal. I had a bit of sheet metal and I used it to test the tip. I did a couple thrusts and it did puncture, though not necessarily a lot. It didn't move into it enough to really do much of any kind of damage. Though the sheet metal was not really suspended in a great way. It was kind of held up but not really braced very well, so I don't know that it's necessarily the best test. When I did a downward strike into the sheet metal, the edge didn't damage. It did scratch quite a bit, but there was no real notable edge damage, which I found, again, pretty surprising. So after that, I wanted to test the tip, and I got a little lazy here, so I just folded the sheet metal and put it on top of the concrete tile. Then jammed the edge or the tip right into that several times, and then proceeded to whack it into the sheet metal kind of haphazardly. At that point, it did damage the sword quite a bit. The edge and the tip held up really, really well, all things considered. In fact, this is how it looks, and I'm surprised it looks as much like a sword tip as it does, given the amount of damage. This is actually still repairable, but yeah, it held up pretty well, especially given what I just did to it. Now, it's time to finish things up here. I moved on to edge-on-edge contact. I'm using the JKOO sword that I tested, the JKOO Tsunami sword from a previous review. And it, first I'm striking the flats of the blade. It leaves some pretty severe marks. That's, I guess, expected if you smack the flat of a blade into the edge of another blade. But it did leave some pretty severe marking. Going into edge-on-edge contact, I am striking it reasonably hard, and it's leaving some pretty good-sized dings in the edge. You can see some of the minor strikes here. This is just an example of one of the softer strikes. The Hutter strikes left quite a sawtooth looking edge. It was struck pretty hard and it absorbed pretty well. I have no complaints. This is typically what would happen, is chunks would break off, and the fact that they're not breaking off in larger chunks is actually kind of surprising. Now I can sense the end is near. I take the JKOO sword, I place it against my stand, and I use it almost like an anvil to brace it. What surprised me is that the JKOO Tsunami broke again. Now that sword has gone through another round of destruction testing, so it really shouldn't surprise me, but I wasn't expecting that to break. I'm striking the spine of the blade to kind of open up some of the cracks that I've made, and it, basically on the next strike it breaks in half. But that's not the end. I need to know if it's a Sanmai blade, and if I look at it just briefly, it does look like it's a Sanmai blade, but I take it to a grinder to flatten out some of the edges. I also, not the edges, but the spot where it broke, so I can get a better view into the blade as I etch it. I do the same with the piece of the JKOO Tsunami that broke off, just as a comparison. And after sitting in kind of household vinegar for a couple days, I think it's pretty easy to see that it does look like a Sanmai blade, especially as I compare it to a different piece. Now, I'm not a metallurgy expert, but in this particular case, breaking in half and sitting in an etchant and giving the contrast between different types in a sandwich-looking appearance does at least provide me with the evidence I need, or at least the information to say that this does look like a Sanmai blade. Though I've seen lots of forgeries and all sorts of crazy things happen, but I think it's pretty tough to fake this one. This looks like a Sanmai blade to me. And that I find actually really impressive. Now, I'm not going to give JKOO a gold star just because they said it was a Sanmai blade and then in fact it was a Sanmai blade. You should do and what you say, and if you advertise something as a particular thing, you should back that up. But it does seem like there's some shenanigans going out from some of the forges in China saying that there's a Sanmai blade, or selling it as a Sanmai or laminated construction blade, and then having it not be that. So the fact that this is actually pretty cool, especially at $320. I find that very cool. So let's wrap things up here. I tested the sword. It did really well. I went through and I broke it. It turned out to be a Sanmai blade. There's some other notable things that I can say. One, the ska is still, the ito is actually still very tight. It's not actually cracked at all either. It's still in good order, and that I find actually really surprising. A lot of times handles will break. A lot of times the kasha will come off. The end knot will come loose. None of that has happened with this handle. This has held up better than any handle I've had in a destruction test. So tip of my hat to you there, JKOO Swords. The sword held up really well, especially considering what I did to it. And I think it's, the fact that you can get this for $320 is just really impressive to me. A lot of times laminated blades cost more. If you actually like this blade, you can actually buy one yourself. JKOO Sword offers this sword on their website, and you can see some of the photos that I took, which is cool because I gave them permission to use the photos that I have. Anyway, you can buy the exact same sword as was used in this review if you want. I don't know that that would be my first suggestion, especially given that the point of this was to really see two different styles of Bohi and to kind of ask for some odd things for the specific sake of them being odd and hard to do. But if you like the swirly Mitsudome theme, if you like the goofy Bohi, then you can get one yourself, which is actually kind of neat. Tickles me a little bit. I think it might be better suited if you were to find one that actually suited your style, or to get one that you liked a little bit better than the one that I chose, but the fact that you can is pretty cool. Now, do I think it's worth it? In short, yes, I think it is a very good deal. Especially if I say that you want a sword that is laminated and folded. I think this is one of the best deals in town. Now, the grain structure, I've been told from the breaking point, looks like it's pretty large, and maybe it doesn't have the best heat treatment, though I guess my rebuttal to that would be that it held up really well through most of the punishing things I put it through, and it didn't break until I started doing really stupid things with it. But to get a laminated and folded blade at this price, I think is a great value. And if that's something that interests you, I think that is definitely something worth considering, because folded or laminated costs a lot more everywhere else, and $320 for a folded laminated blade with a fully rattan wrap saya is quite a deal. Now, if those things don't matter to you, then don't get them, and I think it probably changes the dynamic of, is it worth it or not? But if that's what you're looking for, absolutely. Anyway, I had a lot of fun testing the sword. I hope you enjoyed the review. I hope it was helpful. It's been long-winded enough. If you like the review, throw a like in the thingy thing below. If you didn't, throw a dislike, but I'd really appreciate knowing why, so that I can suck less in the future. And that's really all I got for you. So cheers, and thanks for watching.